Theories of Visuality and the Social History of Postmodernism, Ruminations on a Research Project by Branko Mitrovic. Petrarch once observed that in every discussion it is important to pay attention to what is not said as much as to what is said. The recommendation has significant importance if we want to examine the origins and motivations behind the rise of postmodernism in the final decades of the 20th century. For many people, including myself, the core doctrines of postmodernism are remarkably counterintuitive. By this I mean, for instance, the view that reality is not really there, that it is constructed by social forces such as cultures or languages, that these forces exist somehow independently of, over, and above biological humans, and that they have the capacity to determine the mental states. Obviously, for many people, these ideas must have been perfectly cogent and reasonable, otherwise, the intellectual history of the past 60 years would have been very different. For those of us who are baffled by the wide endorsement of postmodernist ideas and who find arguments in their favor unconvincing, it is natural to follow Petrarch's advice and seek to establish the unstated perspectives that could have motivated such strange views. At the same time, the stated views require analysis too. Once they are listed, the way I briefly summarized them above, the relevance of the boundary between analytic and continental philosophy, for instance, becomes marginal. A good number of analytic philosophers turn out to belong in the postmodernist camp, not only Goodman and Rorty, but also, for instance, Putnam and Berg. The association of postmodernism with the French cultural influence becomes hard to sustain. On the one hand, works of Derrida or Deleuze are anyhow incomprehensible even to experts, and incomprehensible views simply cannot influence anyone. On the other hand, the defining perspectives of postmodernism, as summarized above, can be documented in English speaking intellectual life well before French postmodernist philosophers wrote their works. It is at the same time quite possible to find these same perspectives in German speaking philosophies of history of Weimar era. The transition of these ideas into the USA and the UK via the great exodus of German speaking scholars in the 1930s is easy to trace. The pool of unstated assumptions, the other side of Petrarch's recommendation, is wider and harder to follow. It was the academics that belonged to the generation of 1968 that largely carried out the rise of postmodernism in the 1980s and the 1990s. Their social experience certainly constitutes an important element. Alan Bloom has described the widespread tendency to identify reason with authority during their formative years. It is hard not to think that this accounts, at least, for part of the opposition to rationality that is often manifested by promoters of postmodernism. Theological coincidences need to be noticed as well. The role of culture, language, or society that in postmodernist metaphysics construct reality and determine the mental states of individuals suspiciously resembles the role of God in the writings of Luther and the Calvinist tradition. Except for France, postmodernism has been mainly a cultural phenomenon of Protestant countries. Religious views, it may be pointed out, are not only about God, but about the human relationship to God. People are likely to retain the anthropology of their religion even when they cease to be religious. Culture, language, discourses, epistemes, or society that postmodernist metaphysics relies on are then mainly substitutes for God that reflect a crypto Protestant worldview. The contribution of the 1950s theories of perception, new look psychology, to the rise of the postmodernist worldview belongs, one could say, to both categories. The view that all perception is inseparable from the conceptualization of the contents of perception, that all seeing is seeing as, played an immensely important role in the intellectual life during the 1960s. The view is firmly endorsed, for instance, in Gadamer's Truth and Method, Gombrich's Art and Illusion, Kuntz's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, Norberg Schultz's Intentions in Architecture, Dante's Analytic Philosophy of History, and Goodman's Languages of Art. At the same time, it has unavoidable anti-realist and anti-foundationalist consequences that were typically endorsed but left unstated. By making the contents of perception dependent on their classification and the classificatory capacities of the subject, previous experiences, expectations, and so on, the view necessarily makes the contents of visual experience independent of the actual perceived objects and their properties. Modern psychology of perception rejects this view and assumes that the functioning of the parts of the brain that form our visual experience is impenetrable for conceptual thinking. There exist efforts to establish whether, in some circumstances, such influences may occur, but the idea that this is always the case is long forgotten. All this is very important because if perception is detachable from the conceptual contents associated with it, and this is the standard view of modern psychology, then anti-foundationalism becomes impossible to sustain, while anti-realism can only be advocated as a variation of traditional skepticism. For a historian interested in the cultural history of postmodernism, it is necessary to take into account the assumptions about perception that were taken for granted by its protagonists. Without them, anti-realist and anti-foundationalist claims could not be sustained. More generally, it is hard to deny that the answer to the question of how postmodernism could have happened and what kind of social forces fostered its rise has potentially extremely wide implications for the understanding of the civilization we live in.